My name is Padmini Nidumolu, and I'm the co-founder of Lean and Agile for Women, bringing women's stories, journeys, challenges, and successes to the community with the hope that anybody watching these interviews get inspired and motivated and find their own story and their own narrative and relate to the great stories that these women have to share with the community. Lean and Agile has many pillars, many areas which we are focusing. But in 2019, we have been focusing about bringing 100 women to the community, their stories, their journeys, and providing a platform to the women across the globe to share and support and offer and seek from the community, because this community is large, but it's one. It's been an immense pleasure for us to do these interviews and bring the stories to the community. And as part of this interview series, today it's my absolute pleasure. I'm very honored to bring you an inspiring woman and a bundle of energy, I would say. She's the co-host of the podcast Agile Revolution, which is now rated as the top 6 Agile podcasts that we have available. She's currently at the Boston Consulting Group as an Enterprise Agile Coach and Agile at Scale Associate Director. She has extensive experience working in small and large organizations, and she has done tremendous work in Agile transformation at the enterprise level across many sectors, in fact, including finance, insurance, and government, telecommunications, and much more. She's the author of Agile Forest and co-author of Who is Agile in Australia and New Zealand. She was also a co-chair of the Approaches and Practices stream at Agile Australia, and she co-chairs one of the world's leading Agile podcasts, as I just mentioned, and she regularly presents at both national and international conferences on Agile. She's Renee Troughton, and she has been in Agile space for over 17 years. My pleasure to welcome Renee Troughton to LIA100. Hi, Renee, how are you?
Hi, I'm excellent. Thank you. Thank you for having me on the show.
Absolutely. And then it was a pleasant surprise and a very pleasant experience meeting you at the Agile 2019, Renee. And it's great that we ended up in the same time zone. Otherwise, you would have been almost a day ahead, right?
It was a real struggle. Yes, yeah. It was definitely a struggle, that time zone.
Yes.
So yes, from Sydney, Australia.
Yes. So I'm so glad we were able to, meet in the same time zone, which is definitely not, was going to be easy. So I'm glad we were able to make this happen. Awesome. So I'll dive into my first question then, Renee.
Yeah.
As I was kind of reading up about you and learning about you and, what you've done, the body of work you've done, I came across something called, let me see if I can say this right, the Agile Smorgasbord. You have to tell us what that's about.
Well, it's quite a story, that one. It's a really interesting story. I was actually telling someone about it today because they weren't aware of it. So it's a few years ago, I think it was about 2015, I was increasingly frustrated with the growth of coaches who probably didn't have a lot of experience in different methodologies of Agile. So there was this, that had good experience on the ground in teams as Scrum Masters. And basically all they'd been doing was Scrum, and then they'd sort of move into the Agile coaching foray, but didn't really know an awful lot of approaches aside from Scrum. So I sort of took it upon myself to educate the masses, as I tend to do through a lot of the activities that I do. And the Agile Smorgasbord was a mechanism to do that. So it was basically a highlight of the different methods that were out there. And as I talked to my co-host, Craig Smith, who's also one of the board members for the Agile Alliance, I sort of asked him to co-chair a talk with me. And the concept that we pushed forward was 40 Agile methods in 40 minutes. And so probably a lot of people are aware of 40 Agile methods in 40 minutes because it tends to be reposted a lot from a picture that Lynn Cazale did back when Craig did the presentation once without me. And so now forever, that 40 Agile methods in 40 minutes is now related to Lynn and Craig, and unfortunately not me. And everyone keeps citing it, and no one knows that I actually ended up doing a considerable portion of the work. In fairness, Craig did also do a good portion of the work. But the smorgasbord was the start of that. But the really interesting thing about the smorgasbord was that as I was doing it, it was basically a categorization framework for a lot of the different Agile methods out there. And it was utilized in the 40 minutes talk as a mechanism to sort of give really broad brush highlights about the different approaches that are out there. But I also interestingly found out as I was doing it is that there's some really undercurrent patterns in here that no one's really sort of talked about and identified. And I started to actually think about this as a more holistic method, and it ended up turning into the Enterprise Transformation Meta Model, which was essentially a look at these different dimensions in organizations. So it started to look at, certainly from an integral perspective, I, and then the team, and then department, and then organization was one of the dimensions and one of the axes. And then the other is around how the team works, how the team is governed, how the team is financed, or individuals are financed, and then how individuals and processes are governed and financed, which is effectively HR, right? And so the model then translates different frameworks across those dimensions to demonstrate, for example, that Scrum is really only focused on team practices and doesn't go to beyond team of teams and departments and scale. But obviously, when you start looking at scaled approaches such as SAFe or less and so forth, they do scaling. They also cover something about governance. They're pretty light on in finance, and they're extremely got no coverage in the HR space. And so what intrigued me about this was there's spaces in the organisation that don't have agile techniques or approaches are tailored towards them. And that's really what started me going towards what at the time was called Enterprise Agility, that then turned into Business Agility. And so I was one of the few very early people that was actually talking about models associated with business agility, and obviously sort of talked quite heavily with Evan Laybourne from the Business Agility Institute. And a lot of that content was pretty much the merge of Evan's work and my work brought together into one framework.
Oh, that's really interesting. And I'll now go back and search for that 40 methods in 40 minutes, because that's really intriguing. So Lynn is committed last night to redo the picture, so that finally puts credit for me in, which I'm incredibly appreciative of. There you go. And anybody who's watching this now knows. So that's fantastic. And so Renee, you also did something called Agile Forest, right? And we were talking about this, a little bit earlier, and that's really interesting. So tell us a little bit about what that is, and how did you even come up with this concept or this theme?
Yeah, so Agile Forest is two things for me. I actually have a blog called agileforest.com, and lots of really great Agile stories in there, and I use it more as a mind dump of things that I'm interested in, things that sort of push me and propel me forward. And so I definitely would encourage anyone who's watching this video to take a look, because there's a lot of really great content in there about scaling approaches and so forth. But the idea that I initially had was that it wasn't just a mechanistic world, that I saw Agile as an ecosystem. And it ended up me turning into writing a book about it. And in fairness to those people listening, it's half written, so it's tantalizingly not quite complete. But the intent behind it was, and it still holds really true to this day, was to tell a story about Agile without using any of the Agile lingo. And the potential audience for it wasn't IT folk, it was predominantly for business folk. And it was tell the story as a fictional tale, much similar to Who Moved My Cheese or the Phoenix Project, for people who are familiar with those, in a parable of a group of marsupial Australian animals who were basically put into danger of a particular situation, and then ended up utilizing a lot of agile techniques and principles in order to get themselves out of trouble. And so it sort of goes through and sort of really simplifies the world of agile using the story.
That's super interesting. Now, anybody who's watching this will be very curious how that storyline probably flows. So that's a good teaser for those who didn't read it yet.
Yeah.
That's cool. So, talking about writing something, Renee, right? You must have started writing at some point in your career, right? It could be a LinkedIn publication or this book or anything. And I ask this of all the interviewees, and I get very interesting responses. And I ask this because I want anybody who's watching this to kind of relate to your answer, right? So when you were first contemplating writing something, I'm assuming that you had an internal dialogue, right? A self-talk that, why am I doing this? Am I good enough to do this? What I'm saying might not be the first time that anybody must have, heard about it. So why me, right? Am I good enough? And I'm assuming that this probably was your mindset in some shape or form, though not as intense as I mentioned. If it is true, how did you overcome that, or how did you work with that resistance, self-resistance? And if you didn't have it, it's okay to say that.
I think it's quite unique, maybe for me. I mean, there's a couple of different really intriguing answers. The reason why I haven't finished Agile Forest is I tend to have a lot of unfinished objects, so it's not the only book for me. I write fiction aside from Agile stuff, so I've got a trilogy, a science fiction trilogy, wow, of which I have finished one of those books, and I've started half of the book for the second one, but I've never published it. Aside from it's just me on LeanPub, and I love LeanPub as a platform to write. By the way, I just think it's super easy and super relatable as a platform goes. But I also have like a book which is like a sort of like a fantasy rom-com as well, and I've also started a few other thoughts on Agile books that haven't progressed as far as Agile Forest. But the intent it was never a barrier around me and confidence in the ability to write, because I've always felt that writing has come really naturally and somewhat surprisingly, because when I write, it sort of really helps me solidify my ideas. So I get a lot of joy out of it from the perspective of it helps me a lot. I write for me. I don't generally write for anyone else. But that said, I still, when I speak in presentations, I was absolutely terrible at high school, to the point where I would stutter and I would shake, and it's been a real journey for me. I still am always completely nervous. I've had moments where I felt like I'm about to faint, like 30 seconds before going on stage, and I'm not kidding. I could actually feel the blood coursing through me. So I think, part of my imposter syndrome is I've been always very comfortable writing, but I've been always extremely uncomfortable presenting. More so when it's a stage of beyond 100 people. That's when it really starts to trigger me. So I feel it, but I feel it in a different way. And how I overcome it, I just keep pushing myself, because the only way to overcome that fear is to keep doing it. I hate doing it, but I've got to do it.
And that's incredible. And it might loosely translate to feel the fear, but do it anyway. Right?
Yeah.
So just keep pushing yourself. And that I think that turns into a practice. And I think it's assertive that you're able to do it better, day by day. So
Yeah.
Oh, thanks for sharing that. Okay, so you've been to many conferences despite the fear of presenting and despite the fear of talking, whether you're presenting or attending, right? And I would like to ask you about, what is the pattern or what is the trend that you observe in conferences, especially since you've been in this space for over 17 years now, close to 2 decades? In terms of diversity, and I would like you to have a lens of gender diversity as I'm talking about it, because there are many kinds of diversities, right?
Yeah.
What trends did you observe, Renee, in terms of, did you see less speakers who are, who were women as opposed to more now, or, has it always been the same? How has it been?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So in Australian conferences, I think it sort of mimics the industry of Agile in Australia, and not just the industry of Agile, it's sort of the industry of IT in particular in Australia. So when I first got I started as a software developer, and when I started my first job, I was the only woman on the floor. I had literally the key to the toilet because I was the only woman on the floor. When I was at university, I was 1 in 20 women. It's like the ratio is 1 in 20. And I saw over the years that it got better ratio-wise. However, it's now turned back to basically what it was like for me when I was in university. It's 1 in 20 in IT. And I think in the Agile space, it's equally challenging ratio-wise in Australia. So I have noticed it way more this year coming to Agile 2019 in Washington, that it feels like a lot more women around than it certainly feels like in Australia. And leadership positions in Australia were still very low as well. So it is not, I'd say there are a lot of women in business analysis roles and in Scrum Master roles, but in Agile coach roles and in Enterprise Agile coach roles, we're very few and far between, which is really sad. I think as far as any other trends concerned, aside from inclusiveness, I guess the key difference, and it's quite frustrating for me in Australia, it tends to be very process, practice oriented. And the language, interestingly, around some of the more softer side, like principles and so forth, there's still a lot of language around, it's that touchy-feely stuff, which is probably one of the reasons why there's a lot of less women in senior Agile leadership positions in Australia, unfortunately.
And you're in a leadership position right now, right? You're working as a coach in BCG. What are some of the things that women can, do, or, even kind of break the barriers, internal and external, to be where you are, or to be in that space of leadership?
Yeah. So I was actually talking a bit about this yesterday. I think you overheard the conversation. I think we could do an awful lot more to encourage women in the industry. So one idea that I've got that I just kicked off today was, how can we help grow women thought leaders? And there's many different ways to grow thought leaders, but it sort of came to me as I was looking at the book store that's at the conference, that there's a lot of books. I was actually deliberately looking at the author names as I was going through the range, and about 1 in 5 books were books that were from women. And there's a real direct correlation between writing books versus having those pull requests to speak in conferences. And when you speak in conferences, then it also increases the ratio of accessibility for women who want to attend the conference to see women speakers, but also that balance that's sort of needed inside of the industry. So what I kicked off today was a program where I want to really create a supporting framework around women who want to write and want to step up into that thought leadership space. And it's going to be a group that sort of helps review and to create that supportive commitment of writing, because often the challenge isn't necessarily the idea or the fear. The challenge is for a lot of women, the balance.
Yeah.
So balancing the job, balancing home life, especially with children, because we tend to, I'm not saying that men don't feel it, but we tend to have a stronger burden, whether that's a bit self-imposed or not.
Yeah.
And then you need your own me time as well. And so the thought of going into the thought leadership is quite a challenge when you're thinking about that balance.
Yeah. No, but it's awesome that you are creating the support structure, Renee. And I think we hope more women can take advantage of it. Is it in the early stage of conception, or can you share more details on what the structure is and how people can be invited, how women can be invited?
Yeah, so people can just directly contact me on Twitter through Agile Renee, or through LinkedIn through Renee Troughton, which is also, my handle on there is also Agile Renee. And let me know if you want to be part of the program. But essentially, the conceived structure is we're going to have a session that's around sort of brainstorming and getting some feedback on the concepts. And then we're going to move into something like, I'm not quite sure what the time period, because it depends on the group and what they want to commit to, but something like 3 weekly, let's write a chapter. And everyone writes their own chapter, or they might want to buddy up or pair up to help write, because sometimes it's useful to have someone to bounce ideas off. Yeah. And then at the end of the 3 weeks, that next week, having a review feedback session and just continuing those cycles. And then hopefully we'd love to get a publisher on board as well to help propel the movement forward.
That's awesome. Writing a book in an agile way. That's what this is, right?
In a collaborative, supportive way, yes. Yeah.
Oh, that's really cool. And that's what makes you a thought leader, bringing in, thought leadership and leadership to create thought leaders. So that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the other important elements is have talked to a few other women who have already written books, and obviously getting them to be part of that and to encourage will be very useful as well.
Yeah. And, you travel quite a bit to the conferences across the world, right? And you meet many speakers and attendees from other geographies, right? Because especially, in conferences like Agile 2019, you see people from across the world. In your experience, Renee, have you observed the geographical or cultural, influences on how women take those leadership roles, or feel confident and self-assured that they can do something? Have you seen that cultural impact on them?
I haven't seen a significant cultural impact on that. I have seen a cultural impact about where people are at, as far as what elements of Agile that they pick up, and also where they're at on the journey. So Asia countries are still quite far behind. They're only starting their journey, so they're still learning an awful lot. But because they're behind, they're also not making as many failures. So they get to have the advantage of coming second and sort of living with all the experiences of what works as a consequence of that. As I mentioned, I feel like in America that it's tend to be more balanced between process and mindset. I think, countries like Europe and New Zealand are probably forefront runners in more things around self-selection, for example, and culturally looking more faster towards something like teal, whereas I think something like Australia is quite far behind from that level of looking at wholeness.
Yes.
And what that looks like. And we're really quite far behind in the beyond budgeting in the finance space as well. So I think it really just depends on the element of business agility, but there is differences via countries about how progressive they are in those framework elements.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And I've had conversations with geographies and countries where it's a conservative society, and there's a lot of conditioning of the mind, conditioning of the beliefs that they grow up with, and it's very hard to kind of break free from those beliefs. Some of them are self-made, some of them are imposed by the society and family, and it's quite challenging to kind of break free. So, it's just harder in those countries than others. But yeah, definitely interesting pattern that we see. I was just looking through, you've been doing great work in terms of getting the podcasts on, and I think you have over, if I'm not wrong, 150 or even more.
Yeah, definitely over 150 episodes. We've been going for about 5+ years, and it's a bit of a mix of a show. It has some episodes which are just the co-hosts talking, and it's talking more about the trends that we're seeing on the ground, and a little bit of education in there, and hopefully a little bit of entertainment and fun as well. And then some of the other episodes tend to be more related to some of the speakers that we talk to. So we've done a few podcasts whilst here at Agile 2019. They are going to be awesome podcasts, so everyone should definitely tune into the agilerevolution.com to listen to those.
Wow, we'll definitely look forward to that. I'm pretty sure you tapped into some of the best speakers on your podcast, some guests on your podcast. So we'll look out for that. And, besides what you're doing, your podcast, your books, your publications, what are some of the learning resources that you would like to recommend, Renee? It could be books, it could be any learning resource, really.
Yeah, so there was a stage in my life where I was an extremely prolific reader. I certainly would say that has happened for the last 18 months. It's quite challenging for me with everything going on at work and other life events for me to do a lot of reading. I am starting to go into Gestalt right now, and so I'm researching in that area. But some books in the past, I think the advantage of me starting Agile 17 years ago was back when I started, there were 2 books and about 1 or 2 websites. So I've been really fortunate that when new books have come out, I've been able to sort of read them just in time. And in a lot of cases, I've actually done pre-reads prior to the book going live and given authors feedback as well. So I sometimes get to see them before they come live. And the advantage of that is that I've been able to steadily pace myself out and sort of read an awful lot of content over the time of being a coach. I think what's really intriguing to me is that Agile now is such a broad term, hence, why I ended up going down a 40 methods path. There is so much that you can possibly read. It's like this avalanche of books and content that's out there, which I think is really intimidating for people who are new to Agile. When you see hundreds of books, where to start, what are the right books to start on, it's quite challenging, I think.
Yeah. That's true. In the bookstore that we were seeing today, there were so many new books that have come into the market. And
you'd be forever reading, yes. Yeah. But I think it's great. I certainly believe in a growth mindset. I certainly do try and practice a growth mindset. Some of the books that probably were life-changing for me weren't actually Agile books, but they were what I classify as edgy Agile. So they're things that people do commonly talk about in conferences, but aren't sort of traditional Agile books. So the 2 that probably are of note for me, one was around is Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg. So it made a great difference in the language choice that I chose to use as a coach, but the added bonus is it made a great impact on me in my personal feelings and the presence that I give in the moment, but also the impact that it has on the relationships for me and my family. So the ability to be able to really speak with my children in a very professional and respectful way was very valuable. And then the second book that I'm absolutely crazy for is Byron Katie's Loving What Is. And it's a book about introspection. And it's the only book that I've really found that talks about that gives some real techniques to introspection. And the way that I sort of looked at it was the ability to free yourself from your self-imposed delusions. And it really didn't hit home to me until I read it, just about how much of my own anxiety and pain was created by myself.
Yeah.
And how I interpreted the world and the hypotheses that I had about the world, but I never tested those inner assumptions. And we talk about in Agile, testing and learning and validating your assumptions, but we don't ever validate our inner assumptions. And it's a beautiful book for teaching you how to do that.
Wow. I should definitely go back and explore that, because I have not, read that book, nor did I know so much about that. So definitely. So thank you so much for, sharing those resources. In fact, every interview we are doing, the women are sharing such fantastic learning resources, the books, the authors. It's becoming to be a rich repository if we really go back and consolidate all those books, which I'll probably do sometime. But thank you for
Excellent.
doing that. Yeah. So this has been such a fantastic conversation, Renee. Very rich and very thought-provoking. And as we are wrapping up this interview, is there anything that you want to share with us, a message, a quote, or anything?
Probably my best renowned quote is the one that you'll hear on the podcast, which is "Viva la Revolution."
Love that. Love that. Thank you so much, Renee, for your time and your willingness, and more than anything, your flexibility, to accommodate this interview while you're at this very busy conference here in Washington, D.C. So thank you so much. And we look forward to your new work and your new podcasts and anything else that is yet to come. Thank you so much, and good luck.
Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye.